This lecture is on the psychology of humor. We'll talk about why we laugh, what makes things funny, how we measure the level of humor, and the emotion we experience in response to funny stimuli, which is called mirth. The first question I might ask is, why would we even study humor in the first place? One might wonder this, given that this is something that brings so much joy, so why bother deconstructing something that's meant to bring joy? Certainly, there's a danger here. It's like if you understand love as merely chemicals in the brain. Something's lost there. In the same way, humor, constructed according to some formula, ceases to be magical. It's got to be based on intuition somehow, and needs to feel spontaneous. Planned humor fails to do that. So why study humor? First of all, this is an age-old question. Psychologists, linguists, philosophers, cognitive biologists, comedians, they've all wanted to know what makes something funny. But humor is also ubiquitous. People in every culture experience this emotion I mentioned called mirth. Finally, humor also provides various benefits. For instance, as to our physical benefits, it helps you cope with stress and pain, and it may even boost your immune system. It provides social benefits like that it can ease, when you hear criticism given to you, it can ease the blow of that. It attracts attention and admiration. Certainly, when you're funny, people like you more. And it influences your choices, like your dating and marital decisions, how you spend your money and time in the pursuit of humor, like what videos you rent or what comedians you watch or things like that. And you're more likely to purchase things when marketers incorporate humor into the advertisements, because it attracts our attention and makes those advertisements more memorable and improves brand attitudes. Now that I've explained why humor is something worthy of investigation, we can ask the question, how does one go about studying laughter? Indeed, it's really hard to make people laugh inside a laboratory situation. And that's one reason why relatively few studies have been published on the psychology of humor. It's just really hard to get somebody to laugh, especially when they're devoid of normal social settings where people typically laugh. Social settings can be extremely hard to recreate in a laboratory setting, and especially hard to recreate in a sterile anechoic chamber like you see pictured here. An anechoic chamber is, if you break down this word, an echoing chamber would be one where sound can bounce off the walls. But an anechoic chamber is one in which that's the opposite of that, where there's no echoing possible. So you can see that these are like cardboard cones that have been strategically placed to absorb the sounds so that they can't bounce back and echo throughout this tiny little claustrophobic room. This right here, pictured, is a microphone, and there's a little TV monitor up here on which people can watch YouTube videos and such. And while they're in this room, they are able to, they're exposed to certain funny stimuli, and you try to get them to, you try to manipulate variables that would allow them to feel like something is funny. But researchers have to use these kinds of chambers in order to get good, clean recordings of people laughing on their own, uncontaminated by the sounds of other people. But, like I said, these chambers are very, almost epically unamusing. They're unpleasant, they're small, they're unfamiliar, and so researchers struggle to get people to laugh inside these situations. How do they do it? As with TV shows and comedy clubs, researchers warm people up by spending time with them, watching stuff and laughing together until they're ready to throw them into the chamber and start recording their mirth. There's science behind this. Laughter is contagious, and it's much easier to make someone laugh again if they're already laughing. So researchers try to get groups of people to come in at once and if possible, groups of people who know each other, so that they're all like in a social situation, and then each person, like they'll warm up together, and then each person will go into the chamber one at a time to experience their their turn in the anechoic chamber. We are 30 times more likely to laugh if we're with someone else than if we're on our own. And we're more likely to catch laughter, like in the same way you might catch a yawn, like how people just kind of copy it on accident. But if somebody's laughing, you catch laughter. But you're much more likely to catch laughter from someone that you know than someone that you don't know. Laugh tracks in the background of sitcoms give you that impression of being with other people who also find this content on the show funny, which heightens your own enjoyment of the show. So after researchers warm people up, then they put them in the chamber and let them watch some YouTube videos of things like a laughter chain, for instance, where you're only laughing because you've seen other people on the monitor laughing. Or sometimes they show videos of like TV presenters trying not to laugh for whatever reason. It's especially funny to us, and you've probably seen this in like sketch comedy, where if somebody is like trying not to crack, then it's more enjoyable. It's actually funnier than if somebody's just, like able to stay deadpan. So they might show things like that, or Schadenfreude clips. This is a German word, Schadenfreude, that means harm joy. It's like the joy that you experience when other people are like mildly failing, not like miserable, but like when somebody has a misfortune, like people falling on ice or hurting themselves in some dramatic way, but that's not extraordinarily painful, just like dramatically amusing. Now, laughing in an anechoic chamber is one way to measure someone's mirth, but laughter isn't always a great measure of humor, because you laugh when you're getting tickled, even though it's not funny. You sometimes laugh in a group setting where others are laughing, even if you don't get the joke. So it can sometimes work better not to measure laughter, but rather to just like ask people, how funny is this? And let them answer on like a 1 to 7 scale or whatever. You can stick an electrode on their zygomatic nerve at the side of their face to see the degree of contraction in their smiling muscles. Some researchers have used fMRI and EEG to study humor, and found that voluntary and involuntary laughter originate in different brain areas. Involuntary laughter originates in the limbic system, which is like the emotional center of the brain, and kind of spreads to the brainstem, which is responsible for heart rate and breathing and involuntary actions like that. And so involuntary laughter is kind of mediated in a less conscious part of the brain, whereas voluntary laughter originates in the temporal lobe, which is in the cerebral cortex, the part of our brain associated with conscious reasoning and thinking. The temporal lobe is associated with all kinds of different things, but especially it's involved, as we learned earlier, in memories and in language. And so so people are sometimes making strategic choices about the need to laugh in order to like fit into a group setting or to just appear like they're enjoying somebody's company, perhaps more than they actually are. It can just be a social cue to put people at ease. So anyway, I just was describing that there are lots of different ways that you can study humor. One way is to study laughter, like we see here in an anechoic chamber, but sometimes it can just be to ask people on a scale, how funny is this, or to measure their smiling muscles, or to put them in a brain imaging machine and kind of measure what's going on in their brain. So what makes something funny? There are several theories, as you can see here, these first three, several theories that try to predict why something might be funny, but none of them do a great job. The theories have gotten better over time. This first one is older, and this one's more recent. This is the most recent of all, as of like 2010. But humor still is a bit of a mystery, even today. Plus, it's worth noting that even though some themes emerge in what kinds of things are funny, no one thing is funny to everybody, which is why I've listed other factors down here at the bottom as a way of helping to account for the differences that we see across people. Relief theory was first proposed in the 1700s. It was originally about how humor supposedly relieved tension caused by the humors in your body. You no doubt remember back to other history of science classes you may have taken, and you understand that that early biological theory suggested that you had 4 humors, or 4 biles, that were different colors, and that they would that all illnesses were caused by imbalances in the humors. And so this is what originated the practice of bloodletting. If you released some blood, then that would bring the humors back into balance, because you might have like too much blood in the case of certain diseases. So relief theory suggested that that you could release the tension that was caused by like imbalances in humor in your body by a natural process of letting out a laughter, like an explosion of laughter. But Freud eventually added to that theory, and it's really because of Freud's addition that this theory is still known. He said that that laughter is a way of releasing pent-up emotions as a result of sexual or aggressive kinds of repressions. But despite being sullied by Freud and his addition, the theory still has some merit to it. It suggests that there's a buildup of tension that ends up kind of boiling out in the form of laughter, or eking out more gradually or gently in the form of something milder, like a chuckle or a smile. To illustrate this, I want you to listen to this quote by Kostler. "The sudden bisociation of an idea or event with 2 habitually incompatible matrices will produce a comic effect, provided that the narrative, the semantic pipeline, carries the right kind of emotional tension." So what he's describing here is that a lot of jokes come with a bisociation, or like an incompatibility of 2 different ideas that are joined or married because they share the same word or a very similar sounding word, even though they have very different meanings. And the comic effect, it comes from the narrative that's provided that sets up. It's like the setup of the joke. So we provide some narrative that causes you to expect one of those things to be the case, and you actually end up finding that it's the opposite of what you expected. And so this semantic pipeline, this stretch of meaning, like the build-up, the sentence of build-up to the joke, if it carries the right kind of emotional tension, then when the pipeline is punctured and our expectations are fooled, the now redundant tension gushes out in laughter or is spilled out in the gentler form of smiles. So again, what he's saying here is that if you set up a joke with several sentences of build-up, and then you let out the punchline or the end of the joke, then you realize that there's a violation of your original expectations. So you were set up to believe that you were going to hear one thing, but you actually hear the opposite. And when those expectations are fooled, then the tension between those 2 incompatible ideas gushes out in the form of laughter. It's like an explosion in the pipeline. Something's like the pipe is punctured and steam is spilling out of the chamber or whatever. Now, this tension, as you'll see in other theories, might be caused by 2 incompatible ideas or something being socially inappropriate. Research has also shown that we find it funny when someone grimaces as if in fear of a threat, but then we discover that there wasn't a threat after all, so the tension is broken by an explosion of laughter. That's why scaring people can make us laugh, or why pranks are sometimes funny, because it seems like there's going to be a threat, but we end up discovering that there actually isn't. You can also see this release of tension in the case of nervous laughter. the negative feeling of awkwardness at having said something inappropriate can be offset by laughter, which kind of forces your mood to lift somewhat, because laughter is a positive emotion, so it kind of brings you out of that negative state, and it relieves that internal tension that you felt at having said something that was incompatible with the social niceties of that situation. The next theory that we want to talk about is called incongruity resolution theory. Now, incongruity resolution theory tries to account for the surprisal aspect of humor. The setup leads us to expect one thing, but the punchline gives us something completely different. Now, this is similar to the last theory, but this theory is describing exactly how the setup of the joke and the punchline of the joke stand in tension to each other, whereas relief theory, what we just finished talking about, was primarily about the release of the tension in the form of laughter. So it was describing what laughter or a smile is. This is describing how that smile comes about. So according to this theory, good humor should be unexpected and incongruent. Things that don't belong together should appear funny when you put them together. So here's how that works. First, you have to mentally represent the setup of the joke. Then you have to detect an incongruity in its multiple interpretations. Then you resolve the incongruity by inhibiting the literal, non-funny interpretation and appreciating the meaning of the less obvious one. So here's an example of a comic that fits this theory well. The first thing that's going on here is you activate the heaven schema. So you're setting up the mental representation of the joke by activating the idea of heaven. You've got this angel and you've got some clouds here. Then the second part is, again, to detect an incongruity in its multiple interpretations. So the heaven schema is, of course, the best place ever. But if you read these words in the thought bubble, then you realize that the comic's highlighting that it might actually be boring. And by inhibiting our gut reaction of heaven as the best place ever, we find the irony that heaven might be boring to be amusing. So that's this third step here. We're resolving the incongruity between a boring heaven and a perfect transcendent heaven by inhibiting the literal non-funny interpretation and appreciating the meaning of the less obvious one of the boring heaven. So you start with something like, I know about heaven, but then you read the caption, so it becomes, wait, but heaven's the best place ever. And in order to resolve that unexpected incongruity of those two incompatible schemas, those two ideas that are incompatible with each other, a boring and a glorious heaven, you inhibit the obvious one, the glorious heaven one, and you appreciate the irony of the less obvious, boring heaven schema. Like I said a minute ago, this theory works really well in conjunction with the relief theory that we just finished talking about, where like steam is exploding out of the pipeline of humor. Because once the tension between the incongruous interpretations is resolved, then the pressure of that juxtaposition between the idea of a glorious heaven and a boring heaven is relieved with a chuckle. Well, at least I assume you didn't belly laugh at this, because this is kind of a mild incongruity. It's amusing, but it's not belly laughing hilarious. In verbal jokes, the second schema is often activated at the end in a punchline, such as this joke. How does Luke Skywalker get around without his X-Wing fighter? Ewoks. Ha 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 ha. Notice too how this one-liner is similar to a garden path sentence. So this text supports two different opposing scripts because of the ambiguous reading of the word strikes. The first is that of a tourist being impressed by something in New York, and then the second is the tourist being hit by something in New York. And the word strikes could mean either one. But the hearer is choosing the impression script over the collision script, like being impressed, rather than being hit. Because the other words in the sentence, like stranger, set you up to kind of expect that you're going to be impressed. However, the introduction of this word big car here leads the hearer to understand that this script is actually suggesting that the word strikes is the collision interpretation rather than its potential alternate meaning of being impressed by things. So such a mild incongruities lead us to an important element in the third theory of humor that I want to talk about, which relates to the degree to which we violated people's expectations. So again, in all of these jokes so far, we've set somebody up to think that something was going to happen, and then the punchline shifted their expectations and expressed that, oh, it's actually the opposite of this. So in this next theory, called the benign violation theory, we're going to see how the degree of violation matters. So the benign violation theory says that humor occurs when both of two conditions apply at the same time. So where this Venn diagram overlaps. The first is a situation has to be a violation, and second, it has to be benign. In other words, it has to be inappropriate, but not that inappropriate. A violation is anything that threatens or challenges a person's notion of how the world ought to be. Something seems wrong about the situation, but the violation also has to be benign or relatively harmless. So this theory can tell us not only why things are funny, but also why they aren't funny. Basically, if something is too harmless, it's boring. But if it's too big of a violation, it's offensive. So we have to come to this pretty place right in the middle between being boring and being offensive. So if something is just benign and there isn't any violation, that would be like seeing a shadow on the wall that kind of looked like a sheep. Harmless and not at all funny. But if the shadow that you saw on your wall was phallic in nature, that might be funny because it's a mild violation of socially accepted norms. And something that would make it especially benign is that it's unintentional. It just might be cast by the shape of some furniture in your room. But if something is a malignant violation, like there's nothing okay or remotely acceptable about this situation, then that also isn't funny. That becomes offensive. And there's different lines. Everybody has a different line of what's offensive. Unequivocally, I can say that almost nobody ever finds a Holocaust joke funny. Jokes with malignant violations become unappealing or disgusting or upsetting. But sometimes people can take offense at a joke that for most people might be relatively mild, but for just a few people might feel like it's, like it's too much, like it's offensive. And we actually have a phrase in colloquial English to represent that aspect of the theory. We might say, oh, did I go too far? Or he went too far. And that phrase too far refers to being overly strong a violation. It's no longer benign. So how do you make a violation benign? There are a few ways. The first one is distance. One way that you can do this is if it happens to be someone else, or it happened a long time ago, or it doesn't seem like it could possibly be real, you could separate yourself from the subject of the joke by space or time, by relationships or imagination. So if something isn't distance enough by time, we have another colloquial phrase to represent this faux pas in humor. So I'm going to start here with this time distance one. We say, oh, too soon? Like, you could tease about Hurricane Sandy wiping out the New Jersey shore, but in one study, if people made a joke about that in the month right after the hurricane struck, then no one found it funny. They might say, oh, too soon. But after about 36 days, people found these jokes funny. But then they started to become less funny because the event wasn't fresh in people's minds anymore. Other examples might be like, if you have a relational distance, this thing happened to someone that you don't know, and so you don't have a vested interest in them, and I'll show you about that on the next slide. But you've also got examples of things being relatively unbelievable, like cartoon violence. Then it's like, okay, it's fine to be extremely violent in a cartoon because it's not, it's clearly not real, so it's okay to be funnier about it. If you're physically distanced, like this thing happened in another country, then it's not to your own culture, to your own people, to nobody that you know, and so something that could be more of a violation, more dangerous or more extreme or more harmful, then that can end up being funnier because you're distanced from it, by physically distanced. So again, I was going to tell you about something that was a relational distance. So to illustrate the principle of this relational distance, in one study, 90 participants read 2 scenarios about a woman who accidentally donated money to a cause. She was texting a hotline number, but didn't realize that the donations would end up on her cell phone bill at the end of the month. In one scenario, she accidentally spent $50. In another, she spent $2,000. Participants were asked to imagine, in some cases, that the woman was either a close friend, or in other situations, that she was a stranger. When they imagined her as a friend, the $50 mishap was funny, but the $2,000 mistake was too serious to laugh at. Meanwhile, when the woman was a stranger, the results were reversed. $2,000 was funny, but $50 was just too boring to really, merit a joke. Imagining that the woman was someone who wasn't close to them ended up meaning that the violation could be a lot worse, and the situation would be hilarious because the participants weren't invested in that person or in that situation. So this shows us why mild violations like mishaps aren't funny on the retelling. Colloquially, we might say something like, "You had to be there." The violation was funny in that moment because it happened to someone that was close to you and you witnessed it and it was like a situation you were involved in. But when you try to retell about that story, then it's too distant to be funny. I have an example of that recently happened to me on a Zoom call the other day. One of my colleagues was talking and the sound cut out in the middle of his sentence. So when he came back, someone told him, "You'll have to repeat that. We didn't hear you. All we heard was, I attached, and Matt's team." We didn't hear anything in between. Without missing a beat, he goes, "No, you heard right. I just believe in economizing my words." Now, it was unexpected because we just assumed that he'd restate what he'd been saying, but he didn't. Now, in my retelling this story, I guarantee none of you are laughing. You're too distant from the situation, and the violation of our expectations when he said that little quip was too mild to be funny now. But in that moment, every single other person on the call busted up and actually laughed out loud, because in that moment, it was hilarious. In one study, events that became funnier over time were more serious events, like a car accident, which actually weren't funny at first, but once time had passed, it became funny. While events that were funny at first lost their comedic effect because they were seen as more minor violations, like stubbing a toe. That could be funny in the moment, but if you tell about it later, not funny. Now, a second reason why things can be a benign violation, like a mild enough violation, is if you aren't strongly committed to the violated norm, if your values aren't aligned with the norm that's violated. So, like, for instance, if you hear about a church recruiting new members by giving away a Hummer SUV, most everybody would think that this was out of line, that church shouldn't have raffles to win converts or new members. However, in one study, the people that found this benign were people that were less committed to the sanctity of a church. So the people that were more committed to the sanctity of the church didn't find this story to be amusing because it violated their sensibilities about what a church should be too much to be benign, and therefore wasn't funny. But like an amusing anecdote about this ended up being funny to people who didn't care about the sanctity of religion. And a final way to make a violation benign is to have some alternative explanation of the violation, so that it can be seen as okay in some way. We can call this rationalizing. For example, if someone hurts themselves like they do in all those episodes of America's Funniest Home Videos, but it's more embarrassing than painful, you think, they'll get over it, it's all okay. So like this, in this little GIF that I kind of extracted from the internet, this person's showing off in a cruise ship bunk, and then all of a sudden she slips and she falls, and her brother looks over the edge and is like, But you can see here that this probably wasn't a dramatically painful thing. It was more embarrassing than painful. And so you're like, oh, it's okay. It's fine if I laugh. But a video of somebody accidentally cutting off their hand is not benign. So it would never be funny unless you have a very, very sick sense of humor. Another example of this could be tickling. which is really something that is a physical violation and an attack, but it's also playful and harmless. If your boyfriend or girlfriend or parent or sibling starts tickling you, then you find that perhaps annoying but amusing. If a stranger came up to you and started tickling you, you would not respond that way. You would not actually laugh. You would probably find it terrifying and awful, and you might punch them or something. I mean, it's not it's very different to receive that the incongruity of the playfulness juxtaposed against the attacking nature of this thing. It's very different to experience that from somebody that you know versus somebody that you don't. So if you rationalize that away by saying, oh, it's safe because this attacking kind of motion is coming from somebody that loves and cares about me, then it ends up being humorous instead. So even though we've been talking so far about the benign violation theory, I still feel like the components from the relief theory and the incongruity resolution theory are at play in all these situations that I've been describing. You still need to have two competing ideas or interpretations of something that fight over cognitive attention in your mind. And the tension between your expectations and the violation of your expectations still gets released in a burst of laughter, like the relief theory predicts. So this benign violation theory alone, without the other two, really can't say much about why we laugh at things. If I just walked over to my wife and touched the tip of her nose, that would be a benign violation of her expectations for me. It would be a mild thing, and it certainly isn't what she expects I'm going to be doing, but she wouldn't find it funny. In fact, she would probably find it annoying. So, that's the reason why multiple theories of humor kind of combine together to create one global perspective of humor that involves laughter as kind of like a burst of relief from a particular from various different kinds of tension that might build up inside, from a violation of expectations, or from building up through the buildup of a joke and then giving the punchline, which violates the expectations. But these have to be benign in some way, but benign is defined differently by different people and differently in different situations. And so all these theories combine together to help us understand why things might or might not be funny. But that still doesn't tell us why some people find things funny and some people don't. So we need to talk about other kinds of things that might define for somebody the level of benign, like why something might be funny for one person and not funny for another. So here are some other factors at play. First is, how is funnier than why? For example, events leading up to a breakup can be funny, but the existential reasons why somebody might break up are less likely to be funny. This also suggests why explaining a joke makes it stop being funny. Like if you're analyzing the humor and you're explaining why it's funny, then it's not funny anymore. In fact, analyzing humor is kind of like dissecting a frog. Few people are interested in the process, and the frog dies of it. Similarly, few people are interested in why a joke is funny, and the joke dies when you try to explain it. So if you have to say why it's funny, then it isn't funny. The second thing is the degree of setup. The longer the setup, longer setups result in more humor because they more strongly set up the initial schema. So you're really, really strongly expecting something to be the case. Stand-up comics end up being funnier than comic strips because they have more time to build up to the punchline, whereas a comic strip has to get to the point very quickly. In fact, in one frame, like you saw earlier, you had to set up the schema of heaven, and then the violation happened in that same image, whereas a stand-up comic could spend a few minutes building up to the punchline of a joke. Puns usually elicit groans rather than laughs or even smiles, because they're just there's not a lot of setup there. You just throw it out, and it's just a mild violation of your expectations because you're playing with words. And it ends up not being that funny for most people. Third is the timing of the joke. A quick-witted comment is more surprising and therefore funny than a joke that sounds like it was planned. Also, if you don't at first get a joke, once somebody explains it, it should theoretically still be funny, because the tension between these two ideas will still exist. But after it's been explained to you, then the timing's off, and so it's no longer funny, even if you just, even after somebody explains it, if at that moment when you just got it, you should laugh, but you're not because the timing's off. And then finally, the demographics of the listener matter a lot. The culture, age, gender, IQ, political orientation, and all kinds of other factors can play a role in whether a joke falls flat. For instance, very few old people find clips of people slipping and falling to be funny, because older people are more acutely aware of the reality of the potential of falling themselves. People with higher IQs are more likely to find a pun to be humorous. Eastern cultures, like Asian cultures, value humor in general less than Western cultures do, and when you tell a joke, they find it less amusing. Typically speaking, men tend to find humor that's sexual or aggressive more amusing, whereas women appear to prefer neutral or absurd types of humor. And both sexes prefer to make jokes at the expense of the other gender, rather than their own. So after explaining all of these principles, all these different theories and ideas about humor, and these other factors that also contribute to making something funny or not, pretty much any comedic situation, any story, joke, comic, comedic routine, you should be able to deconstruct and understand the reasons why it might be considered funny, and the reasons why some people might find it more funny and some people less funny. But at the end of the day, you should keep in mind that a deconstructed joke stops being funny, so mostly just appreciate humor for what it is.